The day she had the abortion, he married her. After 3 years of marriage, Eleanor Vance finally became pregnant, only to receive divorce papers from her husband, Robert Sterling, on the same day. Get rid of the child, and sign this. She's back. You should step aside. She trembled as she asked why, but received only one reply: you're nothing but her substitute. And you actually think you deserve to be Mrs. Sterling? On the operating table, Eleanor Vance suffered severe bleeding, almost losing her life. Meanwhile, Robert Sterling was holding the hand of his first love, holding his wedding. She gave up hope. Later, Eleanor Vance married a rising star in the business world, Robert Sterling's rival, Alexander Hayes. She appeared before Robert Sterling, arm in arm with Alexander Hayes. Mr. Sterling, allow me to introduce you. This is my husband. Eleanor Vance no longer loved Robert Sterling. But Robert Sterling went mad. Eleanor Vance stood in the bathroom, tightly clutching the pregnancy test stick that showed 2 red lines. She couldn't stop herself from trembling slightly. She was pregnant. After 3 years of marriage to Robert Sterling, she finally had their child. Robert Sterling would surely be happy, wouldn't he? After all, he had once said he wanted a daughter just like her. Eleanor Vance carefully put the pregnancy test stick into her bag, composed herself, and prepared to give him a surprise that evening. That evening, Eleanor Vance specifically cooked his favorite meal for Robert Sterling and lit a few scented candles. The sound of the door lock turning echoed. She immediately stood up to greet Robert Sterling. Robert, you're back. Robert Sterling's expression was cold and stern, his gaze swept over the dining table indifferently, his tone distant. Is there something you need? Eleanor Vance had long been used to his attitude. She took the pregnancy test stick from her bag and handed it to him. I'm pregnant. We're going to be parents. Robert Sterling looked down at the pregnancy test stick, his eyes unreadable. She's pregnant with my child? How annoying. After a moment, he looked up. Get rid of it. Eleanor Vance's smile froze on her face. She thought she had misheard. What? I said, get rid of it. You don't actually think you're qualified to have my child, do you? He expressionlessly took a document from his briefcase and threw it onto the table. Sign this while you're at it. Eleanor Vance looked down and saw the words on the document clearly. Divorce papers. Her face turned pale. Robert Sterling wants a divorce? Why? Why? Robert Sterling looked at her, his eyes as cold as if he were looking at a stranger. Courtney Evans is back. The position of Mrs. Sterling was always hers. If you had any decency, you'd step down willingly. If you don't listen, Robert Sterling wouldn't mind taking some strong measures. Courtney Evans. Robert Sterling's first love. The first love that Eleanor Vance could never hope to compare to. But Eleanor Vance loved Robert Sterling. She chose to pretend she didn't know about it, hoping Robert Sterling would one day be moved by her sincerity. But men are like that. When they don't love you, all your efforts are just wishful thinking. Robert, I'm already carrying your child. Didn't you say you wanted a daughter like me? A sliver of hope remained in Eleanor Vance's heart. Robert Sterling's face was expressionless. You? Only because you resemble Courtney Evans. If it weren't for Courtney Evans, a woman like you would never have been qualified to step foot into the Sterling family. Robert Sterling felt a deep-seated disgust for Eleanor Vance. She merely bore some resemblance to Courtney Evans, occupied the title of Mrs. Sterling for 3 years, and now it was time for her to step down. Eleanor Vance clenched her fingers tightly, her nails digging deep into her palms, but she couldn't feel the pain. So, for these 3 years, what was I? Robert Sterling looked at her indifferently, his tone calm to the point of cruelty. A substitute. An annoying substitute. Eleanor Vance felt her vision dim and her ears buzz. A substitute? She bit her lip hard until she tasted blood, only then managing to stand steady. What about the child? Her voice was hoarse. Our child, you don't want him her either? Your blood runs through its veins. Robert Sterling's eyes didn't waver in the slightest. I don't need a child born from a substitute. Not even comparable to a bastard. What good would it do to give birth to it? It wouldn't even be fit to be a dog for the child Courtney Evans and I will have. Eleanor Vance finally broke down. She picked up the divorce papers from the table and tore them fiercely. Robert Sterling! How dare you! Her eyes red-rimmed, her voice trembling. It's been 3 years, even raising a dog would build affection. How can you be so cruel? Robert Sterling frowned, seeming impatient with her loss of control. Stop making a scene. Tomorrow I'll have my assistant take you to the hospital to get rid of the child. Robert Sterling turned and left, without a single trace of reluctance. Eleanor Vance collapsed onto the floor. She clutched her lower abdomen tightly, as if that could protect her unborn child. But she knew Robert Sterling always meant what he said. He didn't want her. And he didn't want their child. These 3 years were worthless. Late at night, Eleanor Vance curled up on the bed. Her phone suddenly made a sound. She numbly picked it up. It was a message from an unknown number. The moment she opened it, Eleanor Vance couldn't stop trembling. In the photo, Robert Sterling had his arm around Courtney Evans. They were at the bridal shop, trying on a wedding dress. Robert Sterling's gaze was blindingly tender. Robert Sterling could be this tender, after all. He had never treated Eleanor Vance well, not even in bed. Eleanor Vance had thought he simply wasn't good at expressing himself. Now she understood, she simply wasn't worthy. Thank you for taking care of him for me for 3 years. Now, he's back where he belongs. Eleanor Vance stared at the screen, and suddenly laughed. So, she wasn't even fit to be a substitute. She was just a temporary replacement. And now that the real one was back, she, the fake, should be discarded. The hospital. Eleanor Vance lay on the gurney. In her ears was the mechanical sound of the broadcast. Gynecology surgical area, Eleanor Vance, abortion procedure pre-op. She lay with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Robert Sterling's assistant stood beside her, handing her a document in a businesslike manner. Ms. Vance, Mr. Sterling said that once you sign, he will cover the surgery cost. Eleanor Vance looked at the voluntary termination of pregnancy consent form. She suddenly laughed, trembling as she did so. He wouldn't even come to see me, one last time? The assistant was silent for a moment, then said, "Today is Mr. Sterling's wedding day. He said he didn't want his mood to be affected by irrelevant people." Eleanor Vance closed her eyes. He really couldn't wait. Before the fetus was even gone, he was rushing to get married. The door to the operating room opened. A doctor wearing a mask said, "Where is the family member?" The assistant waved his hand. "I'm not. Mr. Sterling isn't available." The doctor frowned. "There are risks with the surgery. A family member needs to sign." Eleanor Vance raised her hand. "I'll sign myself." She wrote her name forcefully, almost tearing through the paper. This was the last time she would do as he wished. As the anesthetic needle was inserted into her spine, Eleanor Vance couldn't help but curl up in pain. It hurt so much. The doctor frowned. "Stop moving. The fetus is already 12 weeks old. The surgery is very risky." She bit her lip hard, oblivious even when she tasted blood. Her child was already 3 months old. It was formed. But its father was marrying someone else today. Its father didn't want it, and its mother couldn't protect it. The anesthetic took effect. In a daze, she heard nurses whispering, "So pitiful, I heard her husband is getting married today. The mistress is moving in, isn't she? Men are all the same. So pitiful. That man can't keep his pants on, why doesn't he get a vasectomy? Shoo, keep it down, she might hear you." At this time, a grand hotel in the city center. Robert Sterling stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, his expression stern. The secretary knocked and entered. "Mr. Sterling, the hospital called. Ms. Vance is experiencing severe bleeding, her life might be in danger." Robert Sterling frowned. "Why tell me? She has nothing to do with me anymore." Courtney Evans suddenly pushed the door open and clung pitifully to Robert Sterling's arm. "Robert, the minister is waiting. Today is our most important day. Don't keep the guests waiting too long." Robert Sterling glanced at his phone. The screen showed missed calls from the hospital. He was silent for 2 seconds, then pressed the power button to turn it off. Let's go. Eleanor Vance was lucky, she wouldn't die. Today was his good day, he couldn't let Eleanor Vance ruin his mood. In the operating room, the monitor suddenly sounded an alarm. Blood pressure dropping rapidly. Quick, transfuse blood. The patient is hemorrhaging. Prepare for resuscitation. Eleanor Vance felt herself falling, as if countless hands were pulling at her. Was she dying? Maybe that was for the best. Anyway, no one would care. In her final moments, she seemed to see Robert Sterling's face. In the hotel ballroom, Robert Sterling and Courtney Evans kissed, and the guests cheered. No one knew that in the operating room at the hospital, an unformed fetus was PLA set into a medical waste bag. Nor did anyone know that Eleanor Vance's electrocardiogram had flatlined. For 10 whole seconds. She had died once. And come back to life. Late at night, Robert Sterling returned to the bridal suite and turned on his phone. Over a dozen missed calls, all from the hospital. The last one was a voicemail. He tapped to play it. Mr. Sterling, the surgery is over. The fetus has been dealt with. However, Ms. Vance's uterus was severely damaged. It will likely be very difficult for her to get pregnant in the future. Also, after she woke up, she was gone. Gone? Robert Sterling just gave a cold after listening, and hung up. What's wrong? Courtney Evans leaned into his arms. Eleanor Vance ran off. Robert Sterling was indifferent, thinking Eleanor Vance was just throwing a tantrum like before and would come back licking his boots in a couple of days. A trace of viciousness flashed in Courtney Evans's eyes. Ran off? She was just about to settle the score with her, and she actually occupied my lapdog for 3 years. Is she throwing a tantrum? After all, you made her get rid of the child. Robert Sterling frowned, a little impatient. Let her be. Just a substitute, he didn't need to care. Eleanor Vance curled up in the rundown motel, trembling all over. The anesthetic had worn off, and she was drenched in sweat from the pain. She stared at her phone. The screen showed photos from Robert Sterling and Courtney Evans' wedding. She was trembling all over. She opened Robert Sterling's message thread. The last message was still from before her surgery. Eleanor Vance, don't keep me waiting too long. He was waiting for her to sign the divorce papers. Waiting for her to obediently get rid of the child. Waiting for her to disappear completely from his life. She took a deep breath and typed. Robert Sterling, if I died, would you be even a little bit sad? Even just a little. Eleanor Vance sent the message. A few seconds later, a reply came. Stop making a scene, Eleanor Vance. That's enough. She stared at the screen and suddenly felt how ridiculous she was. Even at a time like this, she was still hoping for a trace of guilt from him. Robert Sterling stared at Eleanor Vance's message, a strange dull ache in his heart. What did Eleanor Vance mean by this? It must be another new way to get his attention. Courtney Evans looked at Robert Sterling's distracted state, her eyes filled with malice. It seemed Eleanor Vance was truly a persistent ghost. In that case, she wouldn't mind turning Eleanor Vance into a real ghost. Thinking this, she walked to the bathroom and made a phone call. Find her and clean it up. The person on the other end of the line hesitated. Ms. Evans, this is a human life. Courtney Evans scoffed. She just had an abortion. It wouldn't be strange if she died on the side of the road from severe bleeding, would it? She hung up the phone. She went out and hugged Robert Sterling. Robert, tonight is our wedding night. Robert Sterling responded distractedly. He didn't know why. He just felt like there was an empty space in his heart. Late at night, Eleanor Vance left the motel. She knew Robert Sterling wouldn't look for her. But she had to leave the city. This city held too many painful memories. She didn't want to live here for the rest of her life. Just then, she felt faintly like there were footsteps behind her. She turned around and saw 3 strange men approaching, each holding a knife. Who are you? The man in the lead smiled. Someone paid to have you killed. In your next life, don't go around stealing other people's men. Stealing other people's men? Eleanor Vance understood instantly. It was Courtney Evans. Her body was so weak it was hard to even walk, let alone resist. She closed her eyes in despair. Was she really going to die here? Suddenly, a black sedan charged forward, dire CTLY hitting and sending one of the thugs flying. The other two hadn't even reacted. The car door opened, and a tall, slender figure stepped out. 3 seconds. Get lost. The thugs cursed and rushed forward. The next second. Crack! Bones broke. Eleanor Vance froze in place, watching the man. His movements were ruthless. He dealt with everyone in an instant. He turned and walked towards her. She saw his face clearly. Alexander Hayes. Robert Sterling's rival. The most sought-after figure in the business world. Alexander Hayes knelt down. Eleanor Vance? She nodded weakly, feeling her vision darken. Alexander Hayes suddenly smiled, the smile not reaching his eyes. Quite a mess, Mrs. Sterling. She gave a self-mocking tug at the corner of her mouth. Not anymore. The next second, she couldn't hold on any longer and fainted. Alexander Hayes caught her sliding body. It was sticky, covered in blood. His eyes darkened. He picked her up and walked towards the car. The assistant asked softly, Mr. Hayes, why did you save her? She and Robert Sterling. Alexander Hayes looked down at Eleanor Vance in his arms. After a moment, he looked up. Too many questions. Robert Sterling woke up from a dream with a start. He dreamed that Eleanor Vance was standing by his bed, covered in blood. Robert Sterling, does our child hurt? She was an already formed baby girl. He sat up abruptly, covered in cold sweat. Courtney Evans was woken up and groggily hugged him. What's wrong, Robert? Robert Sterling pushed her away and walked to the balcony to light a cigarette. Strange, why would he have a dream like that? Eleanor Vance was just a substitute. Why would he feel guilty? That child shouldn't have existed in the first place. But his heart felt like it was being squeezed by an invisible hand. The pain made it hard to breathe. In the private hospital, Eleanor Vance felt miserable all over. When she woke up, Alexander Yes was sitting by the bed, toying with a ring. It was Eleanor Vance and Robert Sterling's wedding ring. Did you know? Robert Sterling reported you to the police, saying you stole his things. Eleanor Vance was stunned. She had almost lost her life. And Robert Sterling still wanted to brand her a thief. He wouldn't even leave her with her last shred of dignity. Eleanor Vance felt a bitter taste in her mouth. The person she had shared a bed with, why was he so intent on destroying her completely? Alexander Hayes pinched her chin. Want revenge? I'll help you. Alexander Hayes Villa. Eleanor Vance was sitting on the bed. She had been recuperating here for half a month, and her injuries had mostly healed. The doctor told her it would be very difficult for her to get pregnant again in her lifetime. Eleanor Vance would likely never have a baby in this life. Alexander Hayes walked in, closed the door behind him, and raised an eyebrow as he looked at Eleanor Vance. He was holding a document in his hand. How's your body? Eleanor Vance looked up at him. Not dead yet, she said faintly. She couldn't die. Robert Sterling and Courtney Evans were living so well. Why should she go to hell alone? If she went to hell, she'd drag them with her. Alexander Hayes's lips curved upwards. He seemed pleased with her attitude. He placed the document in front of her. Take a look. Eleanor Vance looked down. Marriage agreement. What does this mean? She asked, staring at him warily. Alexander Hayes wanted to marry her? Alexander Hayes sat down across from her. Exactly what it says. His voice was low. Marry me and go live abroad. Why me? Alexander Hayes smiled, the smile not reaching his eyes. Because Robert Sterling will go mad. Isn't that what you want most? Her breath hitched. You want revenge on him? Not entirely. Alexander Hayes looked at her, raising an eyebrow. I need a wife, and you. Need someone who can help you completely break free from the past. Eleanor Vance was silent for a long time. Of course she knew Alexander Hayes's intentions weren't simple, but did she have a choice? Robert Sterling didn't want her, and Courtney Evans wanted her dead. There was no place left for her in the city. What if I say no? Alexander Hayes stood up and scoffed slightly. Then you can leave right now. But I doubt you'd survive 3 days. Courtney Evans' people were still looking for her. Eleanor Vance closed her eyes, then opened them again. All right, I'll marry you. Alexander Hayes seemed to have anticipated her answer. The corners of his mouth turned up. A wise choice. He handed her the pen. Eleanor Vance took it and signed her name on the agreement. This was a transaction. After signing, Alexander Hayes reached out and lifted her chin. From today, you are Mrs. Hayes. Remember, your past is dead. 3 days later, on a private jet, Eleanor Vance watched the city shrink outside the window. Here lay buried her love, her child, everything. Alexander Hayes sat across from her, his expression indifferent. Regret it? Eleanor Vance shook her head. No. When are we having the wedding? Alexander Hayes looked up, raising an eyebrow. In such a hurry? Eleanor Vance looked at him calmly. If we're putting on a show, we should go all out. Robert Sterling isn't stupid. If we just registered, he might not believe it. Alexander Hayes stared at her for a few seconds, then suddenly laughed. Fair enough. Next week, Paris. Sterling Corporation President's Office. Robert Sterling stared at the news on the computer screen, his face filled with disbelief. Alexander Hayes, CEO of Hayes Group, marries mysterious woman in Paris. The accompanying photo was a blurry side profile, but Robert Sterling recognized Eleanor Vance at a glance. Eleanor Vance. He shot up from his seat. Mr. Sterling? His secretary was startled. Robert Sterling stared fiercely at the screen, his chest rising and falling violently. She married Alexander Hayes. How dare she betray me? How could she possibly dare? Robert Sterling picked up his phone and dialed Eleanor Vance's number. We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service. Robert Sterling's face was grim. He smashed the phone against the wall. The screen shattered instantly. Paris, the bridal shop. Eleanor Vance stood in front of the mirror, wearing a pure white wedding dress. Alexander Hayes was dressed in a suit and tie. Satisfied? He asked. Eleanor Vance looked at herself in the mirror and suddenly remembered the wedding photos Courtney Evans had sent her. She had once thought she would only wear a wedding dress once in her life, for Robert Sterling. But now, she was wearing it to marry another man. It's beautiful. Alexander Hayes stood behind her and put his arm around her waist. Tomorrow, the whole world will know you are my wife. Including Robert Sterling. Eleanor Vance stared at herself in the mirror. Robert Sterling, I will make you experience twice the loss you caused me. Paris, Sacre-Cœur Basilica. Eleanor Vance, arm in arm with Alexander Hayes, walked step by step towards the minister. Guests whispered among themselves. Who is Mr. Hayes's bride? We've never heard of her. I heard she's from the East. Eleanor Vance remained calm. Until Eleanor Vance. It was Robert Sterling. Everyone turned around. Robert Sterling's eyes were bloodshot. The air froze. Eleanor Vance stiffened slightly. Alexander Hayes felt her tension, squeezed her hand, and asked in a low voice, Do you need me to handle this? She shook her head, looked at Robert Sterling, her eyes cold. Sir, I believe you've come to the wrong place. I don't recall seeing your name on the invitation. Robert Sterling stared fiercely at her. He couldn't believe it. Eleanor Vance was really marrying someone else. Eleanor Vance, who had loved H.M. like a dog just half a month ago, was now Alexander Hayes's wife. Eleanor Vance. Stop this scene. Come back with me. He held on to a glimmer of hope. He thought Eleanor Vance was just playing hard to get to attract his attention. Alexander Hayes chuckled softly, standing in front of Eleanor Vance. Mr. Sterling, today is my wedding to my wife. If you're here to offer congratulations, you're welcome. If not, please leave. Robert Sterling stared intently at Eleanor Vance. Are you really marrying him? Eleanor Vance looked at him indifferently and suddenly smiled. Robert Sterling, have you forgotten? We're already divorced. Robert Sterling's expression froze. Right, the divorce papers were the ones he forced her to sign. The child was the one he made her get rid of. Now, why would she ever come back? He opened his mouth, but found he had nothing to say. Just then, Robert! It was Courtney Evans. Courtney Evans's face was pale. How could you leave me alone? What about our child? A child? Eleanor Vance frowned. She looked at Courtney Evans's flat abdomen, trembling uncontrollably. Courtney Evans was pregnant? Her child had just died, and Courtney Evans already had one. Robert Sterling was in such a hurry? Robert Sterling, indeed, a man who couldn't keep his pants on. Alexander Hayes sensed her emotions, put his arm around her waist, and asked in a low voice, "Do you want to cancel the wedding?" Eleanor Vance shook her head. No. She looked at the minister. Please continue. Robert Sterling stood frozen in place, watching Eleanor Vance and Alexander Hayes exchange rings and kiss. They became husband and wife amidst everyone's blessings. Eleanor Vance no longer belonged to him, Robert Sterling. Courtney Evans clung tightly to Robert Sterling's arm. She pleaded softly, "Robert, let's go back." She had long since realized Robert Sterling couldn't forget Eleanor Vance. But for the sake of establishing paternity for the child, she endured. That's right, this wasn't Robert Sterling's child. She didn't even know whose it was. To Courtney Evans, Robert Sterling was just a lapdog. If her sugar daddy wasn't ignoring her right now, she wouldn't have come back to him. Robert Sterling, however, acted as if he hadn't heard, staring intently at Eleanor Vance and Alexander Hayes. She used to have eyes only for him. Now, she wouldn't even spare him a glance. After the wedding, Eleanor Vance and Alexander Hayes left escorted by bodyguards. Robert Sterling chased after them. Eleanor Vance. Let's talk. Eleanor Vance stopped and looked back at him. Mr. Sterling, please have some self-respect. You are a married man now. Don't keep your wife waiting too long. Your wife is pregnant. Don't let her down. She turned and got into the car, never looking back. Robert Sterling stood rooted to the spot. He suddenly felt it. He had lost her. Lost her completely. The hotel suite. Courtney Evans sat on the bed, looking cautiously at Robert Sterling. Robert, are you still angry? Robert Sterling didn't speak, just smoked silently. Courtney Evans bit her lip. I know you don't want this child, but she is innocent. Robert Sterling finally looked up at her, his eyes cold. Are you sure the child is mine? Courtney Evans's face turned pale. What do you mean? Robert Sterling scoffed and threw a document in front of her. See for yourself. Courtney Evans opened it with trembling hands and instantly collapsed onto the floor. It was a pregnancy test report. It showed she had gotten pregnant a full month before they had been together. Robert Sterling had found out. On Eleanor Vance's side. In the car. Alexander Hayes looked at Eleanor Vance and suddenly spoke. Sad? Eleanor Vance shook her head. Just think it's ridiculous. Robert Sterling abandoned me for Courtney Evans, and it turns out the child Courtney Evans is carrying isn't his at all. Alexander Hayes raised an eyebrow. You knew all along? Eleanor Vance chuckled softly. I guessed. She knew Courtney Evans too well. How could a woman like that be content with just one man like Robert Sterling? Alexander Hayes stared at her for a few seconds, then suddenly reached out and pinched her chin. Eleanor Vance. From today, your eyes are only allowed to see me. Eleanor Vance looked up, meeting his gaze. All right. Seeing Courtney Evans' reaction, Robert Sterling couldn't be bothered to talk to her and turned to leave. For 3 days, Robert Sterling didn't come back. Courtney Evans stared at her phone. Robert Sterling hadn't sent her a single message in 3 days. Robert Sterling sent someone to deliver divorce papers. The pregnancy test report from the hospital proved that the child in her belly wasn't his at all. Courtney Evans sent someone to watch Robert Sterling. That person sent Courtney Evans a photo. In the photo, Robert Sterling stood outside Eleanor Vance and Alexander Hayes's bridal suite. All night long. Eleanor Vance. She gritted her teeth, her eyes bloodshot. It's all because of you. Courtney Evans picked up the phone and dialed a number. Hello, brother, help me with something. Ms. Evans, who are you targeting this time? A bitch. I want you to sexually assault her and record it, then post it online. Money? I'll double it for you. Paris. Night. Eleanor Vance returned to the villa alone. Alexander Hayes had an engagement tonight. She didn't want to bother the driver, so she walked back herself. It wasn't far anyway. Just then, Eleanor Vance heard what sounded like footsteps behind her. She quickened her pace. Ah! A hand clamped over her mouth. Don't move, you bitch. Someone paid for a night with you. Eleanor Vance struggled desperately, but how could her strength compare to a man's? She was dragged into a secluded alley and thrown roughly to the ground. THRE. Men surrounded her. Quite good-looking, no wonder you're worth this much. One of them pulled out a phone, pointed it at her. Come on, smile. Eleanor Vance was trembling all over. Bang! A loud noise. The man pressing down on her was kicked directly off her. It was Alexander Hayes. Alexander Hayes took off his suit jacket, rolled up his shirt sleeves, revealing his strong arms. His face was grim. Anyone who touches her, dies. The three men exchanged glances and suddenly rushed towards Alexander Hayes. Alexander Hayes's movements were ruthless. But the opponents were numerous after all. For a moment, it was hard to tell who had the upper hand. In the chaos, that man suddenly changed direction, picked up a knife, and fiercely stabbed towards Eleanor Vance. Alexander Hayes! Eleanor Vance instinctively cried out. Alexander Hayes spun around and shielded her in his arms. Thud! The knife plunged into Alexander Hayes's body. Eleanor Vance's face changed dramatically. Alexander Hayes. Alexander Hayes! The three men saw things were going badly and turned to run. Alexander Hayes knelt on one knee, his face pale, but still holding her tightly. It's okay. Don't be afraid. Eleanor Vance's eyes reddened at the corners. Why did you shield me? Are you crazy? Alexander Hayes looked at her and suddenly smiled. Because. He wiped away her tears. I like you. Robert Sterling stood outside the hospital room. In his hand was a document. It was what he had just found out about Eleanor Vance's abortion. Patient suffered severe bleeding, uterus severely damaged, permanent infertility. Heart stopped during the surgery. His hand was trembling. He thought Eleanor Vance was just throwing a tantrum, thought she was deliberately hiding from him. But he didn't know she had truly almost died on the operating table. And what was he doing that day? He was having his wedding with Courtney Evans, a bitch who hooked up with a sugar daddy behind his back and got pregnant. Robert Sterling closed his eyes in pain. He heard Alexander Hayes was injured and hospitalized. He knew Eleanor Vance would definitely be with Alexander Hayes. He wanted to talk to Eleanor Vance. Robert Sterling found out which the hospital Alexander Hayes was in. Robert Sterling stood at the hospital room door, but didn't dare to enter. Just then, Eleanor Vance's voice came from the hospital room. Alexander Hayes, does it hurt? Her tenderness was jarring. That tenderness used to belong to Robert Sterling. Robert Sterling watched through the glass window as Eleanor Vance carefully applied medicine for Alexander Hayes. Robert Sterling suddenly found it hard to breathe. He had lost her completely. When the police arrived, Courtney Evans was packing her luggage. Ms. Evans, you are suspected of hiring someone to commit murder. Please come with us. Courtney Evans showed no sign of remorse. Murder? Isn't that bitch Eleanor Vance perfectly fine? What evidence do you have? The police frowned. Mr. Hayes has submitted all the evidence, including phone recordings. Courtney Evans collapsed onto the floor. She was finished. Alexander Hayes actually had the evidence. A month later, Alexander Hayes was discharged from the hospital. Eleanor Vance helped him as he left the hospital. Alexander Hayes. She suddenly spoke. Was what you said that day true? Alexander Hayes raised an eyebrow. Which part? You said you liked me. Alexander Hayes looked at her and suddenly pulled her into his arms. Not liked. He lowered his head and kissed her lips. Loved. In the distance, Robert Sterling stood there. His assistant asked softly, Mr. Sterling, should we go over? Robert Sterling shook his head and turned to leave. Some people, once missed, are gone forever.